Paul Bennewitz lived in a place where the night skies never seemed completely dark. Just beyond the horizon, over the fences and watchtowers of Kirtland Air Force Base, there were always lights. Most of them were ordinary. Aircraft taking off, security beacons flashing, the glow of a sprawling installation that never truly slept. But every so often, Paul noticed something different. Strange, colored orbs gliding across the desert sky. They weren't shaped like planes, and they didn't move like them either. They darted and hovered, shifted direction with impossible speed, and seemed to vanish and reappear in ways that defied every law of aviation he understood. At first, he brushed it off. Living next to one of the largest Air Force bases in the United States came with its share of oddities. Experimental projects, classified operations, secret prototypes. It all seemed plausible. Paul, after all, wasn't just a curious bystander. He was a respected physicist and a successful entrepreneur, a man who had built his reputation on electronics so precise that both NASA and the Air Force trusted his work. He assumed what he was seeing was simply evidence of America's cutting-edge technology. Nothing more. But then, something happened that changed everything. Using the radio equipment in his home laboratory, Paul began to intercept signals, bursts of sound and data unlike anything he had ever encountered. They weren't normal radio chatter, and they weren't military frequencies he recognized. They were something else. Strange, jagged pulses that carried the eerie rhythm of intelligence behind them. For a man trained in physics and electronics, it was like discovering a hidden language in the static. Paul convinced himself that what he had stumbled upon was not human. These were alien transmissions, he thought, cutting across the New Mexico desert and into his machines. And if aliens were broadcasting from the skies above Kirtland, then something monumental was happening right on his doorstep. From that moment on, Paul's life would never be the same. What began as a scientist's curiosity quickly spiraled into a dangerous obsession. He recorded, documented, and analyzed everything he could. He reached out to the Air Force with his findings, expecting gratitude, maybe even collaboration. Instead, he entered a labyrinth of secrecy, disinformation, and manipulation. Over the next several years, Paul would be praised in private, dismissed in public, and fed a stream of evidence that pulled him deeper and deeper into the mystery. And the deeper he went, the more his world began to collapse. His family saw him unravel, his health deteriorated, and his mind, once sharp and logical, turned paranoid and unstable. Eventually, he would be locked inside a mental institution, convinced that alien forces were invading and that his own government had betrayed him. This isn't the plot of a science fiction thriller. This isn't a campfire tale whispered to frighten children. It's a true story, one that shows how the U.S. Air Force may have destroyed one of their own, not with bullets or bombs, but with lies. And it all began with one man who looked into the sky and saw too much. Paul Bennewitz wasn't just another curious neighbor with a camera pointed at the sky. He was a man who lived and breathed science, the kind of person who saw the world in terms of circuits, equations, and patterns waiting to be solved. Born with a sharp mind and trained in physics, Paul had an instinct for discovery. In the late 1960s, he turned that instinct into a thriving business. Thunder Scientific, a company that specialized in precision instruments and calibration equipment. The name sounded bold, almost cinematic, but the work behind it was even more impressive. Thunder Scientific supplied highly accurate tools to some of the most demanding clients in the world, among them the United States Air Force and NASA. This wasn't a man tinkering in his garage. This was a respected contractor trusted by the highest levels of America's defense and space programs. His instruments were designed to meet exacting standards, and his reputation was one of brilliance, precision, and reliability. The Air Force relied on his work. NASA relied on his work. And Paul, in turn, felt proud to be part of the larger mission of pushing human knowledge forward. That pride influenced a decision that would change the course of his life. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, Paul purchased a large home that included enough space for him to build a personal laboratory. This wasn't just a home, it was an extension of his work. And his choice of location was no accident. He'd set up right next to Kirtland Air Force Base, one of the largest and most secretive military installations in the country. Kirtland wasn't just big, it was strategic. Spanning thousands of acres, it housed nuclear storage facilities, advanced weapons testing grounds, cutting-edge research labs, and even observatories. It was the kind of place where experimental aircraft could take to the skies under a veil of secrecy, where classified projects unfolded behind guarded doors, and where America's most powerful military technologies were quietly being refined. Living on the edge of Kirtland meant that Paul had a front-row seat to the extraordinary. From his second-floor deck, he could see vast stretches of desert sky and the perimeter of the base itself. It became his nightly ritual to step outside, often with a camera in hand, and observe. What he saw was not always easy to explain. He began to notice strange lights, glowing orbs that would appear suddenly, shift color, then dart away in zigzagging patterns. They moved faster than planes, sharper than helicopters, and sometimes seemed to hover in place before disappearing entirely. For a physicist and engineer, these weren't just curiosities. They were anomalies, and anomalies demanded investigation. Paul did what any scientist in his position would do. He documented everything. He recorded hours of footage, snapped countless photos, and filled notebooks with his observations. Every unexplained light was a puzzle piece, and he was determined to fit them together. Still, Paul remained cautious in his conclusions. He knew where he lived. Kirtland Air Force Base was a hub of classified activity, and strange sights in the sky could easily be cutting-edge prototypes or experimental drones. That explanation made sense, and it satisfied him, at least for a while. But Paul was also a man of curiosity. He couldn't help but wonder, if these were just experimental aircraft, why did they move in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics? Why did they vanish so suddenly without leaving a trace? And why were they appearing so often over one of the most secretive military installations in the world? At first, he reassured himself that what he was seeing was probably just military testing. That was the logical explanation. But deep down, a question lingered. What if it wasn't? What if these lights were something else entirely? That thought was about to push Paul further than he ever imagined. Because soon, his equipment would reveal something even stranger than lights in the sky. Something hidden in the airwaves. Something that would consume him. Paul's fascination with the strange lights over Kirtland didn't stop at simply watching and recording them. He was too much of a scientist to leave the mystery hanging in the air. If there was something unusual happening in the skies, there had to be traces left behind. Some kind of signal, frequency, or electronic footprint that could be detected. And Paul had both the tools and the expertise to look for them. In his home laboratory, just steps away from his living room, Paul began setting up antennas and radio receivers. He experimented with different bands, scanning across ranges that most hobbyists wouldn't even think to explore. This was where his background gave him a distinct advantage. As a physicist and electronics expert, he knew how military signals should sound, how civilian broadcasts were structured, and what to expect from natural interference. So when he stumbled onto something that didn't fit any category, he knew immediately he had found something worth investigating. On certain nights, in the quiet hours when the desert was still, Paul's receivers picked up sharp bursts of sound in the gigahertz range, frequencies far higher than what the military was known to be using at the time. These weren't ordinary transmissions. They weren't the steady hum of radar or the chatter of pilots. They came in clipped pulses, irregular yet oddly patterned, almost like some kind of encrypted language. To most people, it might have sounded like static. But Paul sensed structure in the chaos. He began recording the bursts and feeding them into his computer system. Keep in mind, this was the late 1970s and early 80s, when computers were primitive compared to today. But Paul was not only an early adopter, he was an innovator. He wrote his own programs to analyze the signals, searching for repeating sequences, symbols, and anything that might suggest a code. At first, the results looked like nonsense. Long strings of random characters, meaningless noise spat out by the machine. Anyone else would have dismissed it as a technical glitch or simple interference. But Paul didn't give up. He knew that any real code needed context. So he refined his program, giving it a set of assumptions, words and concepts that intelligent beings might logically use. Ship, base, water, time. With these anchors in place, the program began to map patterns more effectively. And then, the messages started to take shape. The translations weren't perfect, but fragments emerged that sent chills down Paul's spine. Short, clipped sentences, half-formed commands, strange references that hinted at something ominous. One message seemed to read, "Our base secure. Time is short. Friends among you." Another fragment suggested, "We need you. Resist all attempts of control," and another, "Victory delayed. Prepare." The language was crude, broken, and sometimes nonsensical. But the intent felt clear enough. Whoever, or whatever, was sending these signals was communicating something urgent. Imagine sitting alone in a darkened lab, watching a computer screen flicker with words that seemed to come from another world. That was Paul's reality. Every new message felt like a piece of a puzzle no one else on Earth even knew existed. As the weeks passed, Paul grew more confident that he was not only intercepting alien transmissions, but that he was beginning to understand them. He saw references to supplies, bases, even ships. Some phrases hinted at struggles or conflict. Others sounded eerily like warnings. But then Paul took a step that would change everything. If he could intercept their messages, why not try to speak back? He composed his own short transmission and sent it out on the same frequency. He had no idea if it would even be detected, let alone answered. But moments later, his machine lit up with a new burst of data. It was a reply. Paul was no stranger to the Air Force. They weren't just his neighbors at Kirtland. They were his clients. His company, Thunder Scientific, had supplied the military with specialized instruments for years, and he had earned a reputation as both reliable and trustworthy. So when he felt he had stumbled upon something extraordinary, he didn't hesitate to share it with them. He gathered his notes, his recordings, and the fragments of decoded messages. To him, this wasn't about chasing UFO fantasies. This was national security. If alien forces were transmitting right above a major nuclear facility, then surely the Air Force would want to know. When Paul presented his findings, the reaction was mixed. Publicly, the Air Force continued its well-rehearsed script. UFOs didn't exist. Strange lights in the sky could always be explained, and there was no credible evidence of alien contact. But behind closed doors, things looked different. Officials didn't dismiss Paul outright. They listened carefully, asked questions, and even seemed intrigued by the precision of his work. Before long, they went a step further. They quietly offered to fund his research, provided he shared his findings directly with them. For Paul, this was validation. Not only had he discovered something remarkable, but the very institution at the heart of America's defense was taking him seriously. To a man of science and patriotism, that felt like proof he was on the right track. But what Paul didn't realize was that the Air Force wasn't simply impressed by his work. They were concerned. If he could intercept these signals with equipment built in his basement, who else might be able to? And if sensitive transmissions from Kirtland were vulnerable, then America had a problem far bigger than a curious neighbor. That's when a man named Richard Doty entered the picture. Doty was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI. On paper, his job was simple: evaluate Paul's claims and determine whether there was any real threat. In practice, his role was far more complicated. Doty visited Paul at his home, reviewed his films, examined his equipment, and sat with him as he explained the strange lights and alien broadcasts. On the surface, he seemed supportive, even friendly. He didn't mock Paul or dismiss his theories. Instead, he encouraged him. He told Paul his suspicions might be right, that there could be truth in what he was finding. And when he passed along documents and reports that appeared to confirm Paul's fears, it felt like cooperation. It felt like the Air Force was finally pulling back the curtain. But the truth was far darker. Doty's assignment wasn't to help Paul. It was to manage him, to guide his obsession in directions that would keep him busy, keep him talking, and most importantly, keep him away from the real secrets at Kirtland. Paul couldn't see that. He believed he was gaining an inside track into one of the greatest discoveries in human history. Every scrap of paper, every nod of agreement, every hushed confirmation from Doty only deepened his conviction that he was communicating with an alien presence. From that point forward, Paul stopped questioning whether the signals were real. To him, there was no doubt. The Air Force was involved, and that meant the stakes were even higher than he imagined. He wasn't just intercepting stray transmissions, he was standing at the edge of a global cover-up. And the more the Air Force played along, the deeper Paul walked into the web they were spinning. Because they weren't helping Paul. They were watching him. At first, Paul thought Richard Doty was a lifeline, a rare government insider willing to help him make sense of what he'd found. Doty seemed sympathetic, patient, even impressed by Paul's dedication. But the longer their relationship went on, the stranger it became. Doty began to pass along information that felt like classified gold. He would casually mention details about alien activities, hint at underground bases, and produce documents that looked official down to the last stamp and signature. One of these was a set of papers about something called Project Aquarius. According to the document, the U.S. government had been tracking extraterrestrial visitors for decades. It even suggested that secret agreements had been made between aliens and American officials, and that those agreements had broken down. For Paul, this was confirmation. He wasn't just decoding random transmissions in the night. He was sitting on evidence of one of the greatest cover-ups in human history. Each new document Dottie delivered felt like another puzzle piece snapping into place. But Paul didn't know that Project Aquarius was a fabrication, a carefully crafted piece of disinformation designed to manipulate him. Dottie's real assignment wasn't to help Paul expose the truth. It was to keep him busy chasing a phantom. The alien story was bait, and Paul swallowed it whole. To reinforce the illusion, Dottie and others in the Air Force's counterintelligence network went beyond paperwork. They staged props and scenarios around the very locations Paul was convinced were alien sites. Domes and ventilation shafts were placed on remote mesas. Black helicopters flew low and slow where Paul would be watching, their timing no accident. Every one of these events acted like gasoline poured onto the fire of Paul's conviction. With each new discovery, Paul's obsession deepened. He began to see patterns everywhere. The strange lights over Kirtland were now alien craft. The transmissions he decoded were alien communications. The bases in New Mexico weren't just military. They were staging grounds for an interplanetary invasion. And the Air Force, in his mind, was either complicit or fighting a secret war it couldn't admit to the public. He didn't keep these findings to himself. Paul believed it was his duty to warn people, starting with those in power. He sent thick dossiers of his decoded messages, photos, and analysis to senators, defense officials, and even the President of the United States. He pleaded for action, for public disclosure, for preparations against what he thought was coming. But the replies he received were generic, dismissive form letters. The Air Force no longer investigates UFOs. Project Blue Book has been closed. To Paul, this wasn't evidence of disinterest. It was proof of a cover-up. The very lack of response convinced him even more that he was on the trail of something explosive. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Air Force's disinformation machine kept grinding on. Every fake document, every staged sighting, every subtle nudge from Dottie was designed to keep Paul running in circles. The more time he spent decoding alien messages and chasing secret bases, the less time he would have to stumble upon the real classified projects being tested at Kirtland. The plan worked. Paul's life became dominated by the mystery. He spent hours locked in his lab, listening to transmissions, rewriting his programs, scanning for new signals. He rarely slept. He stopped spending time with his family. His once thriving business started to slip from his control. Friends noticed the change. He was more intense, more impatient, more convinced than ever that he had been chosen, or perhaps burdened, with knowledge no one else had. Every new leak from Dottie only reinforced the feeling that he was at the center of something vast and dangerous. To Paul, the pieces fit perfectly. To everyone else, the picture was starting to look like obsession. Yet there was still one thing Paul didn't realize. He wasn't just a researcher anymore. He was a test subject. And the people feeding him information were about to push him even further down the rabbit hole. By the early 1980s, Paul's investigation had taken on a life of its own. The transmissions he decoded, the documents Dottie handed him, and the strange sights around Kirtland all seemed to point to a much larger picture. And in that picture, one location stood out, a remote area in northern New Mexico called Dulce. Dulce wasn't a bustling city or even a large town. It was a quiet community on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, surrounded by mesas, forests, and stretches of desert. But in Paul's mind, this lonely outpost was hiding something monumental. His decoded messages referenced bases, underground, supplies, and rejuvenation methods. Combined with Doty's hints, Paul became convinced Dulce was the site of a massive subterranean installation, part alien, part government, and entirely secret. As his obsession deepened, Paul began telling friends and contacts in the UFO community about his theory. The story spread. Beneath Archuleta Mesa, near Dulce, there were sprawling tunnels and chambers where aliens and humans worked side by side. Some of the decoded phrases seemed to hint at horrific activities: genetic experiments, hybridization programs, abductions of American citizens who were returned with implants that turned them into walking cameras. It sounded like science fiction, but Paul's evidence felt undeniable to him. Unknown to Paul, his conclusions were being carefully nurtured. Just as Dottie had slipped him forged documents, the government now began to shape what Paul saw with his own eyes. Props appeared on the rugged landscape near Dulce. Strange structures that looked like vents or domes, isolated towers bristling with antennas, and unmarked helicopters painted black, flying low and slow at the edges of his view. These weren't random coincidences. They were psychological operations designed to reinforce the story Paul was already telling himself. To a man obsessed, they were confirmation. Every vent was an air shaft. Every tower was an entrance. Every helicopter was a patrol craft. The narrative had become self-reinforcing. Paul saw what he expected to see, and the more he saw, the stronger his convictions grew. He began conducting his own aerial surveys, piloting his plane over the areas he believed hid underground bases. He took hundreds of photos, grainy images of terrain that, to outsiders, looked perfectly ordinary, but that to Paul showed hidden hatches, scorched clearings, and signs of battle. He convinced himself that a violent confrontation had already occurred between the aliens and elements of the US military. Burned patches of ground, flattened trees, and debris he photographed became proof of secret skirmishes fought beneath the public's nose. Each flight, each roll of film, each new discovery took Paul further from his old life. The man who had once built instruments for NASA was now spending his days flying over mesas, scanning for shadows, and nights decoding transmissions he believed were war plans from another world. And as the story in his head grew bigger, so did the stakes. If Dulce really was a hub of alien activity, and if the government really was complicit, then he wasn't just a researcher. He was a lone whistleblower, standing against an interplanetary conspiracy. Friends in the UFO community started to share and amplify his claims. Dulce Base became a buzzword whispered at conferences and printed in niche newsletters. Some believed him. Others were skeptical. But to Paul, the growing attention felt like validation. People were finally listening. What he didn't realize was that he was moving deeper into a maze built specifically for him. The props, the staged activity, the planted evidence, all of it had one purpose: to keep him occupied and discredited. As long as Paul focused on Dulce and aliens, he wouldn't stumble onto the actual classified programs being tested at Kirtland or elsewhere. But by then, it didn't matter. Paul was no longer a cautious scientist weighing evidence. He was a believer. The combination of forged documents, staged sightings, and his own interpretations had created a worldview he couldn't escape. And in that worldview, Dulce wasn't just a town in New Mexico. It was ground zero for an alien takeover. He started compiling even bigger dossiers, filled with his aerial photos, decoded messages, and maps of supposed underground tunnels. He sent them to senators, journalists, and UFO researchers. He spoke of secret battles, genetic experiments, and abducted citizens being returned with implants. Each claim was more sensational than the last, and each drew him further from the man he used to be. To outsiders, it looked like obsession. To Paul, it was duty. He believed he was fighting to save humanity, exposing the greatest threat the world had ever faced. But in reality, he was trapped inside a carefully crafted illusion, one that was about to consume everything he had left. By the mid-1980s, Paul Bennewitz was no longer the same man who had built a respected company and earned the trust of the Air Force and NASA. The bright, meticulous physicist had been replaced by someone who looked constantly over his shoulder, who barely slept, and who lived in a world where danger was always just beyond the front door. The more he immersed himself in his work, the more convinced Paul became that he was under constant surveillance, not just by the government, but by the very aliens he believed he was fighting. He began to notice cars parked too long on his street, shadows moving across windows, and lights in the distance that he was sure were signals. Every unexpected noise was a threat. Every glance from a stranger, a warning. Inside his home, Paul turned his fear into fortifications. He bought guns and kept them within arm's reach in nearly every room. He sandbagged his windows, turning the house into a makeshift bunker. He installed locks, alarms, and improvised barriers. To him, it wasn't paranoia. It was defense. He believed that if aliens could abduct people from their beds, he needed to make his house impenetrable. But the barricades didn't stop the torment. Paul began to insist that intruders were already breaching his home. He told friends and family that, at night, he could feel beings coming into his room. He claimed they injected him with substances that left him disoriented and drove him into the desert against his will. He would wake up back home with no memory of what had happened. His arms, he said, bore needle marks as proof. His family watched helplessly as his health and demeanor deteriorated. The once vibrant, energetic man grew thin and frail. He chain-smoked so heavily that he burned through a pack every hour, filling the house with a haze of smoke. His speech grew frantic, his thoughts scattered. Conversations that used to be about business or science now circled endlessly around aliens, abductions, and betrayal. Worst of all, he began to turn on those closest to him. He accused his wife of being implanted by aliens, insisting she was no longer the woman he knew. His children, who once admired his brilliance, now found themselves stepping in to manage the family business because their father could no longer handle it. The more they tried to reason with him, the more he saw them as part of the conspiracy. Friends who visited were shocked by what they saw. Guns leaning against walls, windows sealed with sandbags, piles of notes and tapes scattered across every surface. Paul lived in a fortress of his own making, but inside that fortress, he was at war with himself. Eventually, the strain became too much. His family, terrified for his safety and their own, made the difficult decision to have him hospitalized. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoia, delusions, and severe mental exhaustion. For Paul, the hospital wasn't a refuge. It was proof. Proof that the government wanted him silenced, that the aliens were winning, that no one could be trusted. He was admitted multiple times over the years as his condition worsened. Each time, he emerged thinner, weaker, and more convinced that the forces against him were real. The brilliant scientist who had once built instruments for NASA now spent his days scribbling notes about alien plots and secret battles underground. The descent was tragic, not just for Paul, but for everyone around him. His wife lost her partner. His children lost their father. His friends lost a colleague who had once been sharp, witty, and deeply respected. The government had set out to mislead Paul in order to protect their secrets, but in the process, they destroyed a man's life. By the end, Paul wasn't simply a victim of his own obsession. He was a casualty of a calculated campaign of disinformation, a campaign that left him isolated, broken, and haunted until the day he died. Years after Paul Bennewitz's life had unraveled, the truth about his ordeal began to surface. Not in a single headline or dramatic confession, but in fragments pieced together by researchers, journalists, and former insiders. The story they reconstructed was more chilling than the alien transmissions Paul had spent years decoding. The signals that Paul intercepted from his home laboratory, those strange gigahertz range bursts he believed were alien messages, were not extraterrestrial at all. They were real transmissions, yes, but they originated much closer to home. According to later accounts, they were generated by the National Security Agency. When Richard Doty first visited Paul's house and examined his equipment, the NSA was quietly brought in. Shortly after, Paul's computer system was swapped out under the guise of testing. From then on, the alien messages Paul received were crafted to lead him exactly where the government wanted him to go. The documents Paul treasured, Project Aquarius and the other supposed top-secret files, were no more authentic than the transmissions. They were fabrications, carefully designed to look legitimate. They contained just enough real jargon and plausible details to be believable. But the heart of their stories was false. Every page was another breadcrumb, leading Paul away from actual classified programs and toward a fantasy so outrageous, no one in the mainstream would take him seriously. Even the sights Paul captured on film, the vents, domes, and towers he photographed near Dulce, had been arranged to reinforce his beliefs. Helicopters painted black, props planted on remote mesas, subtle but deliberate activity timed for when Paul was watching. All of it orchestrated as part of a counterintelligence strategy. It wasn't about aliens at all. It was about protecting real weapons tests, stealth aircraft development, and other classified projects happening at Kirtland and beyond. The Air Force and NSA couldn't simply tell Paul to stop. They had no idea who his contacts were or where his data might be going. If a Soviet spy had been feeding off Paul's discoveries, a direct confrontation could have exposed sensitive programs. Disinformation was safer. Better to flood him with false leads, let him discredit himself publicly, and keep the real secrets safe under the noise. It worked. By the time Paul was publicly warning senators and writing about alien bases under New Mexico, his reputation in mainstream circles was in tatters. No serious journalist or scientist would touch his claims. In the public eye, he was just another UFO crank, exactly as intended. But behind the caricature was a man whose life had been systematically dismantled. His health, his family, his business. All had crumbled under the weight of the fantasy he'd been fed. The cover-up protected the government's secrets, but it destroyed a loyal American scientist in the process. Insiders like Richard Doty would later admit parts of this openly. Doty acknowledged giving Paul false information. He admitted feeding stories to tabloids and UFO researchers. He said it was all part of a program to shape and control the narrative about unidentified flying objects. And yet, even Doty maintained that much of what he spread was based on kernels of truth. How much truth? No one can say. For Paul, the distinction didn't matter. By the time the revelations emerged, he had already lost everything. The story of aliens, underground bases, and secret wars had been written into his life so deeply that there was no escape. He had been, as one researcher later put it, weaponized against himself. This is the devastating punchline of Paul Bennewitz's story. He wasn't crazy, he was made crazy. A brilliant scientist, patriot, and family man was systematically deceived until the line between reality and fiction snapped. His suffering wasn't the collateral damage of some innocent mistake. It was the result of a deliberate strategy. And it worked so well that decades later, we're still untangling the lies from the truth. Why go to such lengths to deceive one man? Why not simply tell Paul Bennewitz to stop, confiscate his equipment, or charge him with violating security laws? The answer lies in the logic of counterintelligence during the Cold War. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the United States was locked in a technological race with the Soviet Union. Every breakthrough in the stealth, surveillance, and weapons testing was a potential advantage, or a potential vulnerability if it leaked. Kirtland Air Force Base, sitting at the heart of that competition, was a hub of cutting-edge programs. Stealth aircraft prototypes, advanced drones, exotic propulsion tests. All of it was happening right over Paul's backyard. From the government's perspective, Paul wasn't just an eccentric neighbor with a telescope. He was a security risk. If a private citizen with off-the-shelf equipment could intercept sensitive transmissions and film secret aircraft, then so could enemy agents. The NSA and Air Force had no way of knowing who Paul might be sharing his information with. For all they knew, he could be passing data to foreign powers without realizing it. A direct confrontation would have been risky. Seizing his equipment or ordering him to stop might have tipped off anyone monitoring him. Worse, it might have confirmed to Paul, and through him to others, that he'd stumbled onto something real. So the Air Force and NSA chose a different strategy. Drown him in fiction. This is the heart of disinformation. You don't just deny the truth, you bury it under so much noise that no one can tell what's real anymore. Feed enough wild stories into a community, and you can make the entire topic radioactive. Too messy for journalists, too embarrassing for scientists, too crazy for politicians. That's exactly what happened to the UFO field in the 1980s. Suddenly, there were stories of underground alien bases, genetic experiments, secret treaties, and hybrid babies. Some of those claims can be traced directly back to the same sources feeding Paul Bennewitz. By flooding the conversation with extreme narratives, the government achieved two goals at once: protect real classified programs and discredit anyone who got too close. Paul became the perfect test subject for this tactic. He was credible enough to take seriously, passionate enough to keep digging, and isolated enough to control. As the lies piled up, he incorporated them into his worldview, broadcast them to others, and in the process turned himself into a public example of why UFO researchers couldn't be trusted. For the people running the operation, it was a success. Sensitive programs stayed hidden. Enemy intelligence agencies learned nothing useful. The UFO community became a swamp of wild stories impossible to sort through. And one persistent, brilliant man was neutralized without a single shot fired. But for Paul Bennewitz, it was a tragedy. He wasn't an enemy of the state. He wasn't a spy. He was a loyal American who thought he was helping. In the end, he was collateral damage. A casualty in a secret war of deception fought not against foreign powers, but against a citizen of his own country. And that's where the story stops being just about Paul. Because if the government could do this to one of their own contractors, a man with a proven record of service and patriotism, what could they do to anyone else? How many other people have been quietly nudged, manipulated, or discredited in the name of national security? How many lives have been quietly derailed to keep secrets buried? That's the uncomfortable question Paul Bennewitz's story leaves us with. And it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. The story of Paul Bennewitz didn't end with him. The web of lies spun around his life stretched far beyond Albuquerque and left fingerprints across the entire UFO community. What happened to Paul became a blueprint for how disinformation could be used to shape not only one man's beliefs, but an entire field of research. In the years following Paul's breakdown, UFO stories exploded in number and complexity. Tales of underground bases, hybrid programs, government alien treaties, and abductions filled books, magazines, and late-night radio. Many of these stories, when traced back, connected to the same disinformation channels that had ensnared Paul. It became nearly impossible to separate fact from fabrication. For serious researchers, this was devastating. Scientists who might have taken a cautious interest in UFO reports now dismiss them outright. Journalists found the field too chaotic to cover without risking their credibility. And the public, overwhelmed by stories that grew wilder every year, began to see all UFO research as the domain of conspiracy theorists and eccentrics. That was the goal all along. By flooding the conversation with noise, the government didn't just protect sensitive military programs, it poisoned the well. The very act of asking questions about unidentified flying objects became suspect. Anyone who pushed too hard risked ending up like Paul, dismissed, ridiculed, and broken. But time has a way of bringing buried truths back to the surface. In recent years, the U.S. government has been forced to acknowledge what it once denied so aggressively. The Navy has released footage of pilots tracking unidentified aerial phenomena, craft performing maneuvers beyond our known technology. Congressional hearings have been held. Programs like AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, have come to light, proving that the government never really stopped investigating. And yet, even with these revelations, the shadow of disinformation still lingers. If officials lied for decades, how much of what we're hearing now can we trust? Are the new disclosures genuine transparency, or just another carefully managed release of information designed to steer public perception? After all, if a man like Paul Bennewitz could be so thoroughly deceived, what chance does the rest of us have of knowing what's real? That's the lasting legacy of Paul's story. It isn't just about one man's tragic descent into obsession. It's about how easily the truth can be buried under layers of lies, and how those lies can ripple outward, reshaping entire communities and generations of belief. So how do we know what's true? The honest answer is, we don't. Not completely. All we can do is question, investigate, and remain cautious about the stories we're told, especially when they come from the same institutions that have admitted to deceiving us before. Paul's story is a warning that truth is fragile, that secrecy comes at a human cost, and that blind trust can be dangerous. He wasn't destroyed by aliens. He was destroyed by lies. Stay curious, stay cautious, and if you believe the truth matters, share his story. Because the only way to keep history from repeating is to remember the victims of the last cover-up.